On a warm Italian afternoon in mid-September 1943, specifically the 15th day of that month, a German officer named Dietrich Peltz stood at Monte Corvino airfield near Salerno, writing notes that would shake the foundations of everything his military establishment believed about warfare. Peltz held the rank of Oberst in the Luftwaffe and was temporarily serving on Kesselring's staff when he witnessed something that contradicted every principle he had learned in his career. His pencil moved rapidly across paper as he documented observations that seemed impossible according to German military science. The Americans had landed on these shores just 6 days prior, yet through his field glasses, Peltz counted 17 operational aircraft launching from terrain that had been nothing but a wheat field the previous day. What he saw next defied explanation within the framework of Wehrmacht doctrine. American C-47 transport planes were conducting normal landing and takeoff operations from a fully functional runway that simply had not existed 72 hours earlier. Under the Mediterranean sun, steel matting gleamed across the landscape, spread like some kind of industrial carpet over ground that German engineers had evaluated and dismissed as unsuitable for aviation operations without at least several months of intensive preparation work. According to the planning documents that Wehrmacht engineers used, constructing a proper airfield required no less than 6 weeks under the most favourable circumstances imaginable, and that assumed no interference from enemy forces. Yet here, before Peltz's astonished eyes, American engineers had created an operational fighter base in less time than German units typically needed to establish even a basic field headquarters. And they had done so while under constant artillery bombardment and repeated air attacks. During the Allied push northward through Italy in subsequent weeks, 27 captured German staff officers would testify during interrogations to their complete inability to comprehend what they called American military sorcery. The fundamental mathematics governing air superiority were being recalculated, not through statistics about aerial combat or pilot training, but through construction timelines that every German planner had been taught were physically impossible to achieve. The revelation that would eventually transform German understanding had actually begun 4 days before Peltz made his observations, on the 9th of September in 1943, when Allied invasion forces stormed the beaches at Salerno. Mixed in with the first wave of landing craft were vehicles that German spotters initially failed to properly identify. Rudolf Sickinius, holding the rank of General Major and commanding the reconnaissance battalion attached to the 16th Panzer Division, filed reports describing American trucks hauling what appeared to be perforated steel sheets, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked like oversized playing cards on specially modified transport vehicles. His intelligence officers analyzed these observations and concluded the sheets must be temporary road surfacing material, perhaps mats intended for supply routes through the muddy Italian countryside. Nobody in the German command structure possessed any conception that they were witnessing the deployment of pierced steel planking, an innovation that would fundamentally revolutionize how wars would be fought. The origins of this transformation traced backward to November 1941, to an insignificant airfield located near a town called Marston in North Carolina. There, American engineers had accomplished what German planning doctrine considered a mathematical impossibility, constructing a 3,000-foot runway capable of handling heavy bomber aircraft in just 11 days. The secret resided in what seemed like deceptively simple design: interlocking steel mats measuring 10 feet in length and 15 inches in width, each one weighing 66 pounds, perforated with 87 holes that reduced overall weight while maintaining structural strength. German military attachés stationed in Washington had actually filed reports about these experimental projects, but when those dispatches reached Berlin, staff officers dismissed them as American propaganda, another example of Yankee exaggeration designed to create intimidation. Wilhelm Schulz, a Hauptmann serving in the Wehrmacht's engineering corps, would later compose a post-war analysis where he wrote that Germans believed Americans were soft, that their society's obsession with comfort and convenience had made them incapable of the harsh improvisations that warfare demanded. German military thinkers could not conceive that this very characteristic, this American intolerance for discomfort, would drive them to engineer comfort directly into the battlefield itself. The first documented German encounter with American runway construction capabilities had actually occurred at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, though the Wehrmacht High Command would not fully grasp its significance for another full year. Japanese reports that reached Berlin through diplomatic channels in late 1942 described American engineers repairing bomb-cratered runways in hours rather than the days that Japanese engineers required. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht dismissed these accounts as Tokyo's attempt to manufacture excuses for their failures in the Solomon Islands campaign. Alfred Jodl, holding the rank of general, reportedly informed his staff that the Japanese were conjuring phantoms to explain away their defeats. But the phantoms were entirely real. The 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion had landed alongside the Marines at Guadalcanal in August 1942, inheriting a partially completed Japanese airstrip. Within a matter of days, despite nightly bombardment from Japanese naval vessels and daily air raids, they had transformed the facility into a base capable of supporting continuous combat operations. The Japanese, whose own engineering doctrine allocated weeks for such construction work, watched in complete disbelief as American bulldozers, operating in continuous shifts around the clock, accomplished in mere hours what their manual labor forces achieved in days. Friedrich von Kleist, holding the rank of lieutenant colonel, was captured at Salerno while commanding an artillery battery, and he spent countless hours interrogating his American captors about their engineering capabilities, unable to accept their explanations as truthful. In letters to his wife that were discovered decades later in American archives, he wrote that they speak of laying runways as one might describe the spreading of a tablecloth, that they have mechanized what should be impossible. The true shock for German commanders materialized when they began to understand the scale of American production capabilities. Each individual steel mat required precise manufacturing to ensure perfect interlocking capability between pieces. The hooks and slots cut into each piece had to maintain tolerances of less than 1/16 of an inch. German industry, despite its well-earned reputation for precision engineering, struggled to maintain such exacting standards while producing just a few thousand aircraft parts each month. The Americans were manufacturing 3 million square feet of this PSP matting every single month by the middle of 1943, enough material to construct 10 heavy bomber bases. At the Carnegie Illinois Steel Company alone, 5 complete production lines operated continuously, 24 hours each day, 7 days every week. The steel arrived from mills located in Pennsylvania, was pressed into the required shape by machines exerting 2,000 tons of pressure, punched with holes following a pattern developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and shipped to ports often before the paint coating had fully dried. Workers who were there later recalled that the factory floor grew so hot from continuous operation that management had to rotate shifts every 2 hours to prevent heat exhaustion among the labourers. The logistical chain delivering these materials to combat zones defied German comprehension entirely. Albert Kesselring, holding the rank of Field Marshal and commanding all German forces in Italy, would later perform calculations showing that moving the materials required for a single American airfield required more shipping capacity than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the entire Mediterranean theatre. Yet the Americans constructed dozens of such fields simultaneously while maintaining all their regular supply operations without apparent difficulty. Wilhelm Schmalz, a colonel whose Kampfgruppe had fought against the Allied landings in Sicily, documented his observations of American engineering operations in a report that survived in Wehrmacht archives. On July 13, 1943, his reconnaissance units observed American engineers beginning work on an airfield near Gela. Day 1 saw Americans clearing vegetation using armoured bulldozers that were impervious to sniper fire. Day 2 saw ground levelled by machines working in complete darkness, using lights that German forces would never dare illuminate for fear of drawing artillery fire. Day 3 saw steel matting arriving on endless truck convoys. Day 4 saw first fighters landing and taking off. Schmaltz wrote that this was not warfare as Germans understood it, that this was industrial conquest. The aviation engineers themselves represented a revolution in military thinking that German doctrine had never contemplated as possible. By 1943, over 118,000 American troops were dedicated exclusively to airfield construction, organized into specialized battalions and equipped with machinery that seemed almost fantastical to German observers. Each individual battalion possessed equipment worth more than an entire panzer company. They had D7 bulldozers that could move 20 tons of earth in minutes. They had graders that could level a field faster than 100 men working with shovels. They had pneumatic drills that could break rock that Wehrmacht pioneers would have been forced to blast with explosives. Klaus Müller, a sergeant serving as a Wehrmacht pioneer, was captured in Sicily and watched American engineers work. He later testified that one American operator sitting on a bulldozer accomplished more in a single hour than his entire company could achieve in a week of hard labor. But it was not just the machines, he explained, it was the systematic approach they employed. They had established procedures for absolutely everything, timed down to the minute. While German forces were still conducting surveys, Americans were already landing aircraft. The operational history of the 814th Engineer Aviation Battalion, captured intact when their headquarters was briefly overrun near Foggia, revealed the stunning pace of American operations. In 5 weeks operating in Sicily, they had constructed or repaired 13 separate airfields. They had removed 6,000 landmines without suffering a single casualty, using magnetic detection equipment that German pioneers did not know existed. They had laid 2.5 million square feet of PSP matting, graded 3.5 million cubic yards of earth, and constructed drainage systems that turned swamps into all-weather runways. German intelligence initially refused to believe these captured reports were genuine. Hermann Balck, an Oberst who would later command a panzer division in France, reviewed the captured documents and declared them obviously fabricated for deception purposes. He performed calculations showing that such work would require at least 10,000 labourers working continuously for 6 months. When informed that the American battalion consisted of fewer than 800 men, he accused his intelligence officers of gross incompetence. The systematic nature of American airfield construction particularly unsettled German observers who studied it. The entire process had been standardized to an astonishing degree. Site selection, surveying, clearing, grading, drainage installation, matting deployment, and facilities construction proceeded according to manuals that reduced complex engineering problems to simple checklists that any trained crew could follow. A captured American technical manual designated TM5255 for aviation engineers became required reading for German staff officers, who struggled to comprehend its casual assumption that any piece of relatively flat ground could be transformed into an operational airfield within 72 hours. Fridolin von Zenger und Ettelin, a lieutenant general commanding the 14th Panzer Corps in Italy, observed American engineering operations from his headquarters overlooking the Rapido River Valley. He watched as the Americans constructed an entire complex of airfields in the valley spread below his position, despite German artillery being positioned on the commanding heights above. In his memoirs composed after the war, he wrote that German forces could destroy American work each night, cratering runways and demolishing facilities, yet each morning the damage was repaired before German pilots finished eating their breakfast. It was not a battle against an enemy force, he explained, but against an industrial process that never stopped operating. The repair capabilities proved even more disturbing to German military thinkers than the initial construction speed. German bombing raids, even when they achieved successful hits on targets, produced only temporary results. Luftwaffe technical officers calculated that a 500-kilogram bomb, creating a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, should close a runway for at least 48 hours, even assuming around-the-clock repair efforts. American engineers typically had such damage patched and operational again in 4 to 6 hours. The secret lay not just in the materials, but in the systematic approach to damage control. Antonio Benedetti, holding the rank of Master Sergeant in the 825th Engineer Aviation Battalion, described the repair process in a letter home that was later published in Stars and Stripes newspaper. "Jerry drops his eggs at 2300 hours, he wrote. By 23:15 we are rolling. Dozers push the debris aside, graders smooth the crater edges, trucks dump fill material, compactors level everything, and we are laying mat by midnight. By 0200, the PSP is locked down and painted with proper markings. By dawn, our fighters are taking off directly over the spot where Jerry's bomb hit just hours earlier. It is like a choreographed dance where everyone knows their moves perfectly." The German Air Force, already struggling with critical fuel shortages and mounting pilot losses, found itself facing an impossible mathematical equation. Every airfield they successfully attacked was operational again before they could possibly mount a follow-up raid. Meanwhile, new American fields appeared faster than German intelligence could update their target maps. A Luftwaffe planning document from October 1943 listed 17 Allied airfields in the Foggia complex. By the time German pilots received their mission briefings based on this intelligence, 24 were fully operational with 7 more under active construction. The specifications of American airfield construction seemed physically impossible to German engineers working with traditional construction methods. A standard fighter strip required 5,000 feet of runway, 150 feet wide, capable of handling aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds landing at 90 miles per hour. German doctrine, based on concrete construction techniques, calculated 6 weeks minimum for such a project under ideal conditions. The Americans routinely completed identical projects in under 72 hours under active combat conditions, often while under direct enemy observation and fire. Joachim Lemelson, a General de Panzertruppe whose troops faced American air power in Italy, wrote in a report sent to OKW that the enemy's air superiority was not primarily a question of aircraft numbers or pilot skill, though both were considerable. It was fundamentally a question of omnipresence. Wherever German forces attempted to concentrate, an American airfield appeared within days. German forces could not interdict their construction because they built faster than attacks could be organized and executed. The composition of aviation engineer battalions fascinated German intelligence officers who conducted detailed interrogations of captured Americans. These units included not just construction workers, but specialists drawn from across American civilian society. There were civil engineers from state highway departments, equipment operators from mining companies, concrete specialists from dam construction projects. One battalion commander had previously managed construction of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Another had built highways through the Rocky Mountains. This civilian expertise was coupled with equipment that seemed miraculous to German observers who remained accustomed to manual labor methods. The Caterpillar D7 bulldozer, serving as the backbone of American airfield construction, could exert 20,000 pounds of drawbar pull, moving boulders that would have required German engineers to use explosives to displace. The Northwest 80D crane could lift entire prefabricated buildings into position in one piece. The Quickway crane could unload an entire truck of PSP matting in 3 minutes, work that would have taken German pioneers an hour using manual methods. Wilhelm Dürr, a major serving as a Luftwaffe base commander, was captured in southern France and spent weeks studying American airfield operations as a prisoner of war. His post-war analysis, written for the United States Air Force Historical Studies Program, noted that Germans operated from concrete runways built by the TOT organization over months or years, or from grass fields that had been developed over generations of peacetime use. The Americans brought their runways with them, like a carpenter brings his tools to a job site. This was not an adaptation Germans could have made because it required an entire industrial philosophy that German culture did not possess. The rapid construction capability fundamentally altered tactical possibilities in ways that German commanders never fully adapted to counter effectively. American commanders could establish forward fighter bases overnight, providing close air support at ranges that had previously been impossible to achieve. They could shift the weight of air power along an entire front in days rather than the weeks traditional logistics required. Most devastatingly for German planning, they could afford to build airfields they might never actually use, creating uncertainty that forced German commanders to disperse their already limited resources. During Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, executed in August 1944, American engineers outdid even their own previous achievements that had already seemed impossible. The 852nd Engineer Aviation Battalion landed with the assault waves and had an emergency landing strip fully operational on D+1, just 1 day after the invasion began. By D+3, they had 2 complete fighter squadrons operating from French soil. By D+7, they had constructed 3 separate airfields, each one capable of handling medium bomber aircraft. German commanders, who had planned their defensive strategy expecting at least 2 weeks before facing significant Allied air power from French bases, found themselves under continuous air attack from the second day of the invasion. Johannes Blaskowitz, a general holding command of German Army Group G in southern France, reported to OKW that the enemy's tactical air power was multiplying daily. Each morning brought reconnaissance reports of new airstrips that had not existed the day before. German movements, possible only at night due to Allied air superiority, were restricted to just a few kilometers before dawn revealed formations to enemy fighters operating from fields that had not existed when darkness fell the previous evening. The cultural shock extended far beyond mere technical capabilities and production statistics. German military tradition emphasized permanence, solidity, and careful preparation in all things. Luftwaffe bases featured concrete runways 2 feet thick, elaborate drainage systems engineered to last decades, hardened hangars built to withstand bombing, and extensive support facilities constructed to permanent standards. These installations, representing millions of man-hours and countless Reichsmarks, were viewed as strategic assets to be carefully defended. The American approach, temporary and flexible and almost disposable in nature, represented a conceptual revolution that German military thinking could not accommodate within its framework. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the famous Stuka pilot, observed American operations while briefly stationed in Italy before the German withdrawal northward. He later wrote that Germans had spent 2 years building their base at Foggia with traditional methods. The Americans rebuilt it completely in just 2 weeks after German forces destroyed it during their retreat. But they did not rebuild it as Germans would have, permanent and solid and traditional. Instead, they laid steel strips that could be pulled up and moved tomorrow if necessary. They erected tent hangars that could disappear in hours. They created military capability without permanent commitment to location. It was warfare without weight, without the anchoring that had always defined military installations. The psychological impact on German troops proved as significant as the tactical advantages Americans gained. Soldiers huddled in foxholes watched American fighters operate from runways built on ground where they themselves had fought just days earlier. Tank crews saw their carefully camouflaged positions revealed by reconnaissance aircraft operating from strips that had not existed when they had dug into those positions. Artillery observers found their targets defended by fighters scrambled from fields built overnight. Johann Schmidt, a Gefreiter whose letters home were preserved by his family for posterity, wrote in November 1943 that the Americans were not fighting a war in the traditional sense, they were building a civilization as they advanced. Wherever they moved forward, airports appeared as if by magic, roads were paved with proper surfaces, telephone lines were strung connecting everything. Germans destroyed, Americans built. German forces retreated from positions they had held for months, only to see Americans build airfields in places Germans had controlled just yesterday. How could any army defeat an enemy who carried his own geography with him wherever he went? The innovation extended well beyond the basic PSP matting that had initially shocked German observers. American engineers developed specialized equipment for every conceivable challenge their forces might encounter. The Rome plow, a massive blade designed specifically for clearing vegetation, could remove trees 18 inches in diameter, while the tractor moved at 5 miles per hour. Specialized drilling equipment could create drainage wells through solid rock formations. Portable rock crushers could convert rubble from bombed buildings into usable runway base material. Chemical soil stabilizers could turn loose sand into surfaces capable of supporting heavy bomber aircraft. Wehrmacht engineers, many of them highly skilled professionals before the war, found themselves reduced to manual labor while watching American teenagers who appeared barely old enough to operate machinery that transformed entire landscapes. A captured report from the 19th Luftwaffe Field Division noted with obvious bewilderment that American boy soldiers, many appearing no older than 18 years, casually operated equipment worth more than entire German engineering companies possessed in total value. The prefabrication revolution particularly stunned German observers who witnessed it firsthand. Entire airfield facilities arrived in numbered crates, ready for assembly like gigantic construction toys. Control towers 40 feet tall were erected and made operational in 8 hours. Hangars covering 15,000 square feet were operational in 2 days. Fuel systems with underground storage tanks and miles of piping were installed and functioning in 72 hours. Operations centers, complete with sophisticated communications equipment, were functioning within 24 hours of the equipment arriving on site. Ernst Zimmermann, a lieutenant colonel serving as a Luftwaffe logistics officer, performed careful calculations showing that establishing equivalent facilities using German construction methods would require 2,000 tons of concrete, 500 tons of steel reinforcement, 50,000 man-hours of skilled labor, and a minimum of 8 weeks under perfect conditions with no interference. He watched Americans achieve superior results using 100 tons of prefabricated materials, 50 men, and 72 hours of work. The supply chain supporting this construction miracle defied German comprehension of logistics on every level. Each aviation engineer battalion required 2,000 tons of equipment and supplies to establish a single fighter field. A bomber base required 5,000 tons. Yet American Liberty ships, themselves products of revolutionary production methods that built complete vessels in weeks rather than years, delivered these materials directly to invasion beaches where specialized landing craft designed specifically for transporting PSP brought them ashore. Within hours of hitting the beach, steel matting was moving inland on trucks manufactured in Detroit, using fuel refined in Texas, following maps printed in Washington. Gustav von Zangen, a general der Infantry whose 15th Army faced American forces in Holland, described watching American C-47 transport aircraft land on a runway that his troops had been defending just 48 hours earlier. His operations officer insisted the grid reference must be wrong because there was no airfield at that location according to all intelligence. Von Zangen had to show him through field glasses, pointing out that the Americans had constructed it while German staff officers were writing their reports about successfully holding the position. The strategic implications gradually became clear to German commanders, though the realization came too late to develop any effective countermeasures. The American ability to project air power absolutely anywhere, instantly, through engineering rather than through combat victories, meant that traditional concepts of front lines and rear areas became functionally meaningless. Every German position, no matter how distant from established Allied bases, was potentially under immediate air threat. Reserve forces could not concentrate without inviting attack from fighters operating from runways that had not existed when the movement orders were originally issued. Gerd von Rundstedt, a field marshal commanding all German forces in the West, issued a directive in May 1944 that revealed the Wehrmacht's growing desperation in the face of American engineering capabilities. Enemy airfield construction capabilities must be assumed to be unlimited, the directive stated. All operational planning must assume Allied tactical air support will be available within 72 hours of any landing or breakthrough operation. Traditional calculations based on distance from known enemy airbases are no longer valid for planning purposes. The directive proved prophetic in its assessment. After the Normandy landings on D-Day, American engineers performed even more spectacular feats than they had achieved in Italy. Advanced landing grounds sprouted across the Normandy countryside like mushrooms appearing after rain. A-Log 1, located near Sainte-Mère-Église, was fully operational on D+3. By D+10, 9 separate American airfields were operational in Normandy. By D+30, there were 24 complete airfields functioning. German units found themselves under constant attack from aircraft based so close to the front lines that pilots could fly 4 or 5 combat sorties daily, returning to rearm and refuel in mere minutes between missions. Hermann Buchner, a captain serving as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer who compiled extensive reports on American engineering capabilities, wrote a post-war analysis that survived in American archives. Germans were not defeated by American courage, though Americans certainly had courage in abundance. Germans were not defeated by American weapons, though their weapons were excellent in quality. Germans were defeated by American engineers who made geography itself irrelevant to military operations. They built their victory, runway by runway, across the entire European continent. The pinnacle of American airfield construction efficiency came during the Rhine crossing operations executed in March 1945. The 834th Engineer Aviation Battalion crossed the Rhine River at Remagen and had an emergency strip operational on the eastern bank by the end of the second day after crossing. They were landing C-47 cargo aircraft, carrying supplies directly to the bridgehead before German commanders believed such operations were possible. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer-Lehr Division during this period, reported to his superiors that the Americans brought their air force with them like mobile artillery. Where they arrived in the morning, their aircraft were operating by evening. German forces could not move in daylight, could not concentrate forces, could not effectively resist. The Americans had industrialized warfare beyond German comprehension. The numbers told a story that no amount of German courage or tactical skill could possibly overcome. By war's end, American aviation engineer battalions had constructed or reconstructed over 1,000 airfields across Europe and the Pacific theatres. They had laid over 300 million square feet of PSP matting, enough material to build a continuous runway from Berlin to Moscow. They had moved 500 million cubic yards of earth, graded 50 million square yards of surface, and installed 1,000 miles of drainage pipe. They had accomplished in mere months what German military engineers calculated would require decades of peacetime construction effort. Werner Kreiper, who served as Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe, made a final assessment while in American captivity that captured the totality of German miscalculation. Germans planned for a war of armies and battles, of courage and sacrifice, he explained. The Americans fought a war of logistics and construction, of bulldozers and prefabricated materials. Germans could destroy, but Americans could create, and creation proved more powerful than destruction in modern warfare. Wehrmacht veterans, when interviewed decades after the war ended, consistently cited American engineering capabilities as the most psychologically devastating aspect of fighting the Western Allies. Unlike combat itself, which German military tradition had thoroughly prepared them for, the industrial transformation of warfare left them conceptually defenseless. They could understand being outfought in battle. They could not comprehend being outbuilt in construction. Karl Heinz, a Feldwebel who served as a veteran of both the Eastern and Western fronts, explained the fundamental difference in a 1975 interview. Against the Russians, Germans fought battles in the traditional sense. Against the Americans, Germans fought factories. When German forces destroyed a Russian position, it stayed destroyed until Soviet forces could bring up reserves to recapture it. When German forces destroyed an American position, it was rebuilt before German troops could reload their guns for another bombardment. The Russians had courage and vast numbers. The Americans had bulldozers and steel matting. Heinz admitted he feared the bulldozers more than he feared enemy soldiers. The portable airfield technology reached its ultimate expression in Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine River, in March 1945. American engineers jumped from aircraft with the paratroopers, carrying lightweight aluminum planking designed specifically for rapid runway construction in airborne operations. Within 6 hours of landing behind enemy lines, they had established landing zones for gliders carrying additional equipment. Within 12 hours, they had an operational airstrip capable of evacuating wounded soldiers and bringing in supplies by air. German commanders observing this operation realized that American forces had achieved the ultimate military flexibility. They could establish air superiority absolutely anywhere, instantly, regardless of terrain conditions or enemy opposition. Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a General de Fallschirmjäger and Germany's most experienced paratrooper commander, watched American airborne engineers work and later admitted that Germans had invented airborne warfare as a concept, but the Americans had perfected it into a science. Germans could seize objectives through airborne assault. Americans could build bases anywhere they landed. Germans could capture existing airfields. Americans could create new ones from nothing. Americans had industrialized even the most elite form of warfare imaginable. The contrast with German construction methods became increasingly stark as the war progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. The Luftwaffe's own construction units, known as Luftwaffe Bautruppen, operated with methods essentially unchanged since the First World War. They relied heavily on manual labor, often using forced workers and prisoners of war for the hardest tasks. A typical German airfield construction project in 1944 might employ 5,000 workers laboring for 3 months to achieve what an American aviation engineer battalion could accomplish with 800 men in 3 days. Walter Grabmann, a general major commanding the 3rd Fighter Division, described inspecting a captured American airfield in France and being astonished by what he found. Everything was temporary in nature, yet completely functional in practice. The control tower was constructed of prefabricated wood that could be dismantled in hours, yet it contained better equipment than German permanent installations possessed. The hangars were canvas stretched over steel tubes, looking like circus tents, yet they protected aircraft better than German concrete structures because they could be quickly repaired or replaced if damaged. It was the architecture of victory, he concluded. Substance without permanence, capability without commitment to location. The cultural implications extended far beyond purely military considerations. German military tradition valued permanence above almost all else, creating monuments to engineering skill that would last for generations. The Luftwaffe's pre-war airfields were architectural statements in themselves, featuring Art Deco terminals and monumentalist hangars designed to inspire. American airfields were purely functional, designed to last exactly as long as military necessity required and not one single day more. This philosophical difference reflected deeper disparities in how the two nations approached warfare itself at a fundamental level. Heinrich Fokker, the designer of Fokker-Wulf aircraft, visited American-constructed airfields after his capture and wrote his observations. German engineering seeks perfection, he noted, the ideal solution that will stand forever as a testament to skill. In peacetime, the German approach might well be superior. In wartime, the American approach proved devastating in its effectiveness. While Germans were still calculating stress loads and planning for permanence, Americans were landing aircraft on temporary runways. The speed of American construction created tactical opportunities that German doctrine had never anticipated and could never effectively counter. During the breakout from Normandy, American commanders could issue orders for air support from fields that would be constructed after the orders were issued but before the actual attack commenced. Patton's Third Army in its race across France was supported by airfields that advanced almost as rapidly as the ground troops themselves, maintaining continuous close air support at ranges that should have been theoretically impossible. Hermann Zimmermann, serving as operations officer for Luftflotte 3, reported in August 1944 that American fighter bombers operated at will. seemingly unlimited by any range considerations. German intelligence estimates of American capabilities, based on known airfield locations, were rendered worthless because they built new fields faster than intelligence could catalogue them. Germans were fighting an enemy who reshaped geography itself to suit his tactical needs at any given moment. The repair capabilities proved just as decisive as initial construction speed. During the Battle of the Bulge, German commanders counted heavily on winter weather to ground Allied aircraft and allow their offensive to proceed without air interference. They had not calculated that American engineers could clear snow from PSP runways in minutes using specialized equipment, while German fields with traditional concrete runways remained unusable for days after snowfall. The ability to maintain continuous operations in weather conditions that grounded the Luftwaffe entirely provided a decisive advantage at the critical moment. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and demoralizing. Unlike attacking permanent installations where cumulative damage would eventually render them unusable, attacks on American fields seemed completely pointless because damage never accumulated. Young Luftwaffe pilots, already facing overwhelming numerical odds in every engagement, lost all motivation for missions that achieved nothing lasting. Veterans reported that squadron morale collapsed entirely when intelligence briefings showed that targeted airfields were operational again within hours of successful bombing attacks. Wolfgang Fischer, a lieutenant flying the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, one of Germany's last technological hopes for achieving air superiority, described his experience in post-war accounts. The jets gave German pilots a speed advantage that should have been tactically decisive. But speed meant absolutely nothing when the enemy had airfields everywhere imaginable. Germans could outrun American fighters in straight-line speed, but could not outrun American geography. Every emergency landing field that German jets might use was either destroyed or captured. Every field Americans needed appeared overnight as if by magic. The production statistics behind American airfield construction capabilities defied German comprehension of what industrial capacity could achieve. The United States produced enough PSP matting to cover 200 square miles using steel that Germany desperately needed for manufacturing tanks and submarines. The manufacturing process required precise engineering and quality control standards that German factories, operating under constant bombing and severe resource constraints, could never have maintained at any production level. Yet Americans produced PSP alongside record quantities of aircraft, ships, vehicles, and every other implement of modern war. Albert Speer, serving as the Führer's armaments minister, studied captured American production figures and initially concluded they must be propaganda fabrications. When post-war analysis confirmed their complete accuracy, he admitted that Germans could not conceive of such industrial capacity because it exceeded not just German means, but German imagination itself. The Americans were not just fighting a different war with different methods, they were fighting in a completely different century from a technological standpoint. The legacy of American airfield engineering haunted German military professionals for decades after the war ended. In NATO planning sessions during the 1950s, former Wehrmacht officers would interrupt discussions of potential Soviet capabilities to ask detailed questions about airfield construction capacity, traumatized by their wartime experience of American engineering overwhelming all traditional military calculations. Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his memoirs that Germans had prepared for every military contingency except one particular scenario, that the enemy would simply build his way to victory regardless of tactical situations. The Americans treated Europe like an enormous construction site, and they possessed the tools and methods to reshape it according to their operational needs. Germany's finest tactical minds were defeated not by superior strategy, but by American bulldozers and prefabricated construction materials. The transformation of warfare that American aviation engineers represented went far beyond mere technical capability or production capacity. They embodied an entirely new approach to military problems that treated traditional constraints as engineering challenges to be solved through innovation, rather than as fixed limitations to be accepted and worked around. Mountains, rivers, swamps, and vast distances that had shaped European warfare for thousands of years became minor inconveniences to be bulldozed, bridged, drained, or simply ignored through air power. Albert Kesselring, reflecting on the entire Italian campaign from his post-war perspective, made perhaps the most eloquent summary of German bewilderment in the face of American methods. Germans were the inheritors of Clausewitz and Moltke, he noted, masters of operational art, students of 2,000 years of accumulated European military wisdom. Germans knew how to fight effectively in every conceivable terrain, under every possible condition, against every type of enemy force. But the Americans did not fight terrain in the traditional sense, they transformed it to suit their needs. They did not accept conditions as given, they created new conditions favorable to their operations. They did not defeat Germans in decisive battles. They built their victory piece by piece, runway by runway, until German expertise became irrelevant and German experience became worthless. The final humiliation came during the occupation period when German officers were required to attend American engineering demonstrations as part of re-education programs. They watched aviation engineer battalions construct complete operational airfields in training exercises, accomplishing in mere hours what German doctrine stated categorically required weeks of intensive effort. Veterans of the Wehrmacht reported leaving these demonstrations in tears, finally understanding the complete totality of their strategic miscalculation. Joachim Müncheberg, a highly decorated fighter pilot with 135 confirmed victories to his credit, attended one such demonstration in 1946. He wrote to his wife describing how that day he watched American engineers build in 4 hours what Germans could not build in 4 weeks of continuous work. He finally understood why Germany lost the war, he explained. Germans brought warriors to what was fundamentally an industrial competition. Germans thought that courage and skill would somehow triumph over material superiority through force of will. Germans did not comprehend that Americans would make their material superiority so completely overwhelming that German courage became strategically irrelevant. The numbers provided a sobering epilogue to German military pride. American aviation engineers constructed 235 major airfields in Europe alone, not even counting hundreds of emergency strips and temporary facilities. They laid enough PSP matting to build a highway stretching from London to Istanbul. They moved enough earth to fill a canal running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They achieved construction rates that German engineers, even when using slave labour forces, never remotely approached. In the Pacific Theatre, the statistics were even more staggering in their implications. American engineers transformed coral atolls into major air bases, built runways through jungle terrain that German observers had evaluated and deemed completely unusable, created operational facilities on islands that German strategic planners had dismissed as worthless. The apex of this capability came at Tinian Island, where American engineers built what became the world's largest airfield complex in 1944, featuring 6 separate runways, each over 8,000 feet long, from which B-29 Superfortress bombers would launch the atomic attacks that ended the war. Friedrich Ruger, a vice admiral serving as Germany's senior naval engineer, studied American construction methods extensively during his post-war internment. His conclusion was stark and unambiguous. Germans measured military power in traditional terms like divisions, ships, and aircraft inventories. The Americans measured military power in tons of concrete poured, miles of runway laid, cubic yards of earth moved. Germans were absolutely correct that modern industrial war would ultimately be won by industrial power. Germans simply never imagined that industrial power could be projected directly onto the battlefield itself, that factories could function as weapons just as surely as cannons or tanks. The revolution in military engineering that American aviation engineers represented fundamentally changed how warfare would be conducted for all future conflicts. The ability to create air superiority anywhere on Earth, instantly, through engineering capability rather than through combat victories, rendered traditional military geography completely obsolete. Distance from established bases, terrain obstacles, and seasonal weather conditions, factors that had governed military operations throughout all of recorded history, became minor variables in American operational planning. Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured warfare doctrine, made a final assessment that captured the existential shock to German military thinking. Germans had perfected mobile warfare, he acknowledged, the blitzkrieg concept that conquered continental Europe in stunning campaigns. But the Americans achieved something far greater in strategic impact. They achieved mobile infrastructure itself. They did not just move armies quickly across terrain, they moved entire industrial civilization. They brought their complete industrial base directly to the battlefield, assembled it while under enemy fire, and operated it effectively in combat conditions. Germans were still fighting the previous war using previous methods, while Americans were inventing entirely new forms of warfare. The story of German encounters with American airfield construction capabilities is ultimately a narrative about conceptual defeat at the most fundamental level. The Wehrmacht, inheritor of centuries of European military tradition and proven excellence, found itself facing an opponent who had transcended that entire tradition completely. American aviation engineers did not defeat German military art through superior tactics. They made German military art strategically irrelevant to outcomes. They proved conclusively that in modern industrial warfare, the ability to build was more powerful than the ability to destroy, that creation could overwhelm destruction, that engineering could triumph decisively over traditional tactics. Paul Hauser, an SS Obergruppenführer and one of Germany's most decorated combat commanders, provided perhaps the most poignant epitaph for German military presumptions in a conversation with American interrogators after his capture. "You Americans kept insisting you would win because you could outproduce us," he recalled. "We laughed at such claims, thinking you meant simply more tanks and planes rolling off assembly lines. We did not understand you actually meant you would produce the battlefield itself, that you would manufacture the very ground we fought on. You did not defeat the Wehrmacht through superior combat, you bypassed it entirely, building your victory on runways that did not exist when battles started." The German generals, who had devoted their lives to studying Napoleon's campaigns in minute detail, who could quote Clausewitz from memory and debate the finer points of Schlieffen's planning, who understood every classical principle of European warfare, found themselves completely undone by American teenagers operating bulldozers. They had prepared meticulously for every conceivable form of warfare, except the one they actually faced: industrial construction executed at battlefield pace, engineering deployed as a primary weapon system, building itself as a form of combat operations. In the final analysis, German military professionals were left with a truth too bitter to fully accept even in retrospect. They had not been outfought in any traditional sense, but rather outbuilt by an industrial system operating at unprecedented scale. The finest army Europe had produced, perhaps in all of military history, had been defeated not by superior strategy or tactical brilliance, but by engineers who could transform wheat fields into operational air bases overnight, who could repair bomb damage in hours that should have required days to fix, who fought not with courage alone, but with steel matting and bulldozers and an industrial philosophy that treated geography as a construction problem to be solved. Wilhelm Keitel, a field marshal signing Germany's unconditional surrender, reportedly told General Eisenhower that Germans knew they would eventually face American industrial might. They simply did not know they would face it directly on the battlefield in the form of engineers who could build faster than Germans could destroy. Eisenhower's reply, if the account is accurate, was characteristically direct and telling. "That is precisely why you lost this war," he said. The legacy of this revolution endures in military doctrine practiced worldwide. Modern warfare universally assumes rapid airfield construction, forward base development, and expeditionary engineering as fundamental military capabilities that any competent force must possess. The revolution that so thoroughly shocked German generals in 1943 has become so completely routine that modern military officers cannot even imagine conducting warfare without these capabilities. Yet for the Wehrmacht officers who first witnessed American engineers unrolling complete runways from the backs of trucks, it represented the precise moment their world ended and an entirely new age of warfare began. They had expected to fight Americans as soldiers against soldiers. They had not expected Americans to abolish the battlefield itself as a fixed entity, replacing it with an industrial landscape that appeared and disappeared according to tactical requirements. They had not imagined that their enemy's greatest weapon would prove to be not any tank or plane or gun, but rather the capability to transform any random piece of ground into a fully operational airbase, instantly, repeatedly, unstoppably, regardless of what German forces did to prevent it. The German generals never imagined that American engineers would unroll airstrips from trucks overnight as if spreading carpets. They were catastrophically wrong in that assumption. That single miscalculation, more than any particular battle or campaign, explains why the Wehrmacht, undisputed master of continental warfare, found itself helpless before an enemy who had industrialized victory itself into a repeatable process. In the end, the Germans brought a military force to what was fundamentally an engineering competition, and they lost before they even understood the true nature of the contest they had entered.